It's almost like lifting a stone and then finding what's lurking underneath that rock, isn't it? The Nupur Sharma case has caused this stone to be lifted, has caused the light of public scrutiny to be shone underneath this particular stone. And I think there is a great opportunity to do a bit of housekeeping, to take a broom and really clean up what is it's a residual relic of a colonial orientation, and that doesn't serve Bharat's journey anymore. This is a great opportunity to look at the mechanisms whereby these justices suddenly appear there in a manner which is almost the gods on Olympus looking down and sort of tossing down lightning bolts as judgments, without any fear of consequence. All of these institutions, all of these justices, all of these principles, they exist to protect the Nupur Sharmas of the world. They
Yes.
don't exist as some abstract, um, shall we say, play that certain elevated beings can sort of dab in and out of and just have a bit of a hobby sort of an existence. No, this is the very fabric whereby a society protects its vulnerable people, whereby a
Yes.
society protects its values, its aspirations, its relationships. All of these are now in this container, and the justices have nowhere to go. Voting and then going to sleep until the next election is not the way in which a democracy can thrive. For a democracy to thrive, every day has to be a day of engagement. You're contributing your
Yes.
opinions and your hopes and your desires and your wants, and you're participating in society. That's
Yes.
what a democracy is. And, in Bharat, we have to recognize this, because there are other communities who have recognized this. And not only have they recognized this, they happily say, well, this is how you choose to work. We will
Yes.
work within this system to our benefit.
Yes.
How
They've
much
been very organized.
yeah, how much longer does the Bharatiya have to wait to figure this out? And once
Yes.
they figure it out, then all of a sudden they have the control over resources. They have
Yes.
control over decision making within the political framework, within the legislative framework, within the judiciary. It
So,
doesn't take it doesn't take much more. We don't need a revolution. All we need is engagement.
Jai Shri Krishna, Namaste, and welcome to Chitti Media's Current Affairs Show. Today we'll be talking about the recent observations that have come from the Supreme Court of India. And to discuss matters further, we have our in-house special guest, Pandit Satish Sharma ji. Panditji, welcome.
Pranam Saloni ji, namaskar, Jai Shri Ram to you. Thank you for choosing this topic. It's timely, it's contemporary, and it has some very important aspects which I think are worth exploring. Let's see what we can uncover.
Yes, there are so many questions coming from the public at the moment regarding the neutrality of their legal system. For the Supreme Court to be making these kind of observations before they've even heard anything, it's quite unsettling. People are wondering why they've already come out with these observations. Would it be fair for Nupur Sharma to go any further, considering how they're already thinking? She's only exercised her legal right to jump straight to the Supreme High Court. I believe they called her arrogant for doing so. What is your opinion on this at the moment?
So, if we just step back for a moment, firstly, let's recognize that the Supreme Court as a body is a number of justices, and it's the same Supreme Court which passed the triple talaq legislation, for example. So, it would be unfair to just jump in and tarnish the whole institution. Having said that, it's worth having a look at the individual justices, and I think that's where we start to scratch our heads and just consider whether what we've assumed them to be is actually what they are. Um, I agree with you, firstly, that the observations were completely gratuitous and they were uncalled for. They have, in my opinion, tainted, unnecessarily, they have tainted and coloured the manner in which Nupur Sharma will be received in any subsequent court. And the Supreme Courts, they tend to be very careful with their language. They tend to be very sort of deeply aware that anything they say becomes law. And so it's uncommon for them to be so emotional, and especially um, almost capricious in the way that they have gone over and beyond what was required of them. The issue in front of them was actually quite a straightforward procedural request. She wanted to have all of the FIRs bundled together and treated in one location. She'd asked for New Delhi. For whatever reasons, the court could have said, thank you, but no thank you. We don't wish to do this. End of story. Go back to the High Courts. And that would have been normal. That would have been expected. Um, I'm surprised they made that decision in the first instance. It's an entirely reasonable request for an individual having one incident being looked at to have to run up and down the country going to all the different courts where FIRs have been registered for
Yes.
that same one incident. It makes a mockery of the principle of natural justice. And so that aspect was unusual, but as I said, justices tend to be a law unto themselves, and so anything can happen in a courtroom. Perhaps he had a terrible night the night before, didn't like the look of the expression on the face of the counsel, and sadly made a capricious observation. But when I look at this, there's another dimension I think it's always worth having a look at. Each of us, especially our dharmic family, we have a connection with what justice is. We know instinctively when an injustice has been perpetrated. We feel it, and then afterwards we understand it. And humanity has this instinct, and what it's tried to do is to enshrine that instinct into words, and those words pretty much are what law is. It's an attempt to capture in language the sense of justice and injustice that we all feel. So it's important for any judgments that come out of the Supreme Court to recognize that that's what they are. One aspect which I do think is a little bit worrisome is that the Supreme Court is it's a vestige, a vestigial organ of the colonial power. And there is an element of colonialist supremacy about the manner in which they conduct their affairs. A remark was made by the justice that, by one of the visiting justices, who I think he was speaking at an event in the United States, and he said, "We are beholden to no one. We answer only to the Constitution. The Constitution is our deity, as it were." Well, actually, in a democracy, that's not true. In a democracy, the ultimate authority is the people of the land. They
Yes.
are who you answer to, and they are the people who look to you for impartial, wise law and justice.
Yes. Yes.
And so the first thing, this allegiance to the Constitution is a bit of an anachronism. There was a time when the British used to pick the justices, and the higher authority above the Supreme Court was actually the British legal system.
Right.
And so when colonialism sort of semi-disappeared, so we think, in 47, that top tier above the Supreme Court was no longer an authority that could be referred to. And so what we have is a Supreme Court which is not, it doesn't seem to indicate that it has obligations to the people of the land, but it has obligations to a piece of paper, which was actually just a cut and paste of constitutions of Wales and other jurisdictions. And the Supreme Court should know that. They should know that the Constitution is not something that was etched in stone by lightning at the top of a mountain, on tablets of stone and then carried down by some figure saying, God has spoken, here it is. It was something put together by fallible men, and it has a lot of work to be done to it. So that situation, if you bear that in mind, it suddenly makes it more comprehensible that we have a capacity for capricious judgments and remarks made by an institution which still feels beholden psychologically, if subliminally, to a colonialist way of dealing with the natives of India. And this, I think, we saw very much present in the judgment that was made by the justice.
Yes. Many public opinions have said that they feel that Nupur Sharma has been scapegoated because she was accused basically for the current disharmony that's happening in India, the murder in Udaipur, and they're questioning why can a Supreme Court accuse one girl who did some comments in a debate? How can she, without trial, she's already been, victim shamed? How can the people feel more comfortable under the legislation of India, given the current climate, and of tensions? Because we all know tensions have been happening way before the last few days of Nupur
Mm,
Sharma.
mm, mm. Well, I think that that remark was probably the most unwise of all of the remarks. You know, consequential liability, how far does it stop? The dominoes, the first domino you say is the one that has caused all of the subsequent dominoes to tumble. So, at which point does liability stop? How do we decide this? And if you have a look at the consequences of the Hindu community not responding to the serial vilification and humiliation attempts which have been going on in Gyanvapsi, if this justice's words are to be taken into account, then really, if a group of people were to act in a manner which was violent and illegal and causes a great deal of disharmony about that Gyanvapi situation, then actually they wouldn't be liable for it. The person who made those obnoxious remarks about the shivling,
Sibling,
he
yes,
would be liable, and
yes.
so he should actually be completely. He should be brought in front of the justices, and this should be established. And similarly, if that was the case, then what happened at the Babri Masjid when the the decades of humiliation that were heaped upon the Hindu community came to a point where they said, no, this is not acceptable, then in
Yeah.
fact, there is no case for holding those Hindu activists liable at all because they were responding to the initial instigator, supposedly under this new principle of law. It's an entirely unacceptable. We are each of us responsible for what we do with our bodies. We are each of us responsible for what our actions are. We choose to be offended or we choose not to be offended. So we are responsible for even that capacity to give and receive offense. And that is common law, that is common practice, that is mature wisdom. This is what grown ups do. And so it seems to be it's an aberration to make such an unwise remark that a person responding to instigation, to incitement, is somehow guilty of consequences, but the person doing the incitement is not. So very
Yes.
unwise, very unwise.
A lot of people are saying that the courts are appeasing a certain community and not looking at things impartial. They need to be more fair. And for a court of that caliber, it's the Supreme Court. Nupur Sharma went straight to them because her case could set a precedent. At the moment, people are now questioning, is India now an intolerant country?
Mm.
Is there no longer any free speech? Where do we go
Well,
from here?
yeah, and this is you've hit the nail on the head. This is the heart of it. There's one other aspect, a test that I do from time to time, and let's see how it works here. As I said, it's not possible to judge the institutions of Bharat without placing them against the backdrop of their colonial history. And so sometimes I look at a remark made by a member of an institution and imagine if it was made by a white English person.
Mm.
And so all of a sudden it makes sense, doesn't it? Because this is the sort of judgment that you can imagine a white colonialist Christian um, imperial agent sitting there looking down at the natives and in a moment of disgust with their terrible habits and everything else makes some sort of a supremacist remark and then passes a judgment. One thing that strikes me is that when judgments come from the Supreme Court, I always look at, does this serve the evolution of Bharat on its journey to regain its national identity, its
Or,
historical identity? Or does this serve to promote the trope that the Hindus are a vicious, savage majority, that all of the other minorities are vulnerable just by virtue of the fact that they are minorities? And is
Yeah.
justice being ladled out to support that dichotomy and to keep that tension in place? And this judgment, I think, it is exactly the sort of judgment that a colonialist master, wanting divide and rule, wanting to vilify and demean the slave population, would give. It's not the judgment that an indigenous officer of the law of the highest court in the land would give, bearing in mind community harmony, bearing in mind legal precedent, bearing in mind all of the principles that go with law and justice. So that's the way I read it. I read this as being a completely and wholly inappropriate judgment by this justice. And there should be a mechanism whereby the Supreme Court judges can be made accountable to the people of the country, because we are not a colonial vassal state anymore. And the
No.
Supreme Court justice, like all the institutions, must be accountable.
Yes, this particular bench comprised of two judges. And if we recall, even only just last week, we were all praising the Supreme Court for vindicating Modi from 2002. So, does it? The Supreme Court is an institution comprised of individuals. So, can we tarnish the whole legal system, or is it particular judges that people are calling for to be impeached?
Well, I think one of the advantages and benefits of this is it's almost like lifting a stone and then finding what's lurking underneath that rock, isn't it? The Nupur Sharma case has caused this stone to be lifted, has caused the light of public scrutiny to be shone underneath this particular stone. And I think there is a great opportunity to do a bit of housekeeping, to take a broom and really clean up what is it's a residual relic of a colonial orientation, and that doesn't serve Bharat's journey anymore. This is a great opportunity to look at the mechanisms whereby these justices suddenly appear there in a manner which is almost the gods on Olympus looking down and sort of tossing down lightning bolts as judgments, without any fear of consequence. And that has to be resolved. And the collegiate system is, in an ideal world full of people who are wonderful and harmonious and of noble character, a wonderful system. But I'm afraid in the real world, that system is obviously open to abuse. And
Absolutely.
there are now allegations of nepotism. There are allegations of
Yes.
all sorts of criminal charges and questions over integrity and probity, all sorts of charges. And the Supreme Court must be tarnish free. It must be completely free of any of these possible, shall we say, legal minefields. If, let's say, heaven forbid, one of the justices is found to be guilty of corruption, for example, that means all of the cases that that justice has presided over would need to be reviewed. So
Yes.
it's unbelievably important that the pinnacle apex court is beyond reproach in terms of its adherence to principles. And so this is an opportunity for the people of Bharat to express their dissatisfaction, which they are doing in volumes which is
Yes.
unprecedented. And
Yeah.
let's sort this Supreme Court out. We must have an apex body which can be relied upon. Sloaniji, there is one aspect I think I'd like to emphasize here as well, and
Please
sometimes we
do.
overlook this. Each of us has a number of rights, and one is the right to use force in defense of self, property, family, and so on.
Yes.
And we choose not to avail ourselves of that right. We give that authority to the state. We say to the state, you can use force on our behalf to protect us, so that
Yes.
we don't, in a moment of rash emotional instability, we don't lash out and cause harm, which later might be proven to have been wholly inappropriate and unjust. So we give that authority to the mechanisms of law. The apex of that little pyramid is the Supreme Court. And if the people of a country lose confidence in the Supreme Court and its ability to honor that trust, then there is a very serious problem. And that problem is the beginning of a complete loss of trust in the mechanisms of law and order. And if that happens, we regress. We regress to that state where the community then says we cannot trust the judiciary, we cannot
Yes.
trust the servants and the officers of the law, so we have
Yes.
to protect ourselves. This is how serious this issue is. And I think there's going to be a lot of head scratching going on amongst the rest of the justices, because this brings all of their judgments, all of their process of being elevated to these positions under scrutiny. And so
Yes.
let's see. Justice cannot be delayed. Justice delayed is justice denied. And I think this is really not Nupur Sharma who is on trial. This is the Supreme Court justices now and the collegiate system which is on trial.
Yes. So, just touching on what you were saying before, in layman's terms, basically, it's to remind the public that they do have a legal right to defend themselves. Because reading some of the comments on social media, a lot of people have been like, how could, in Udaipur, how could have he defended himself against these two perpetrators that beheaded him? People could have come and helped him. People can, at the time, use instant force if necessary to defend life. By the time you call the police, by the time you go through the court system, it's all too late. So maybe people need to learn basic self defense. Would that be something that you would maybe advise?
I would, firstly, I always fall short of advising anything. I'm more than happy to contribute an opinion and
Yes,
wisdom and context, but ultimately, each of us is responsible for our own safety. There
yes,
is little to be gained by having a moral stance and adhering to it posthumously. It really doesn't help you. It's of no benefit to anybody for it to be recorded on the post-mortem that this person refused to, in any way, shape, or form, use force to defend themselves. It
yes,
didn't work for the Tibetans.
no,
It hasn't worked for anybody who was um, shall we say, loyal to a lofty principle at the expense of
yes,
their physical well-being. And so
yes,
there is a common sense aspect to what you have said. The, there is a This is the foundation of all societies, the right to freedom of life and then subsequent rights. I often talk about this. And so I don't think there is any issue in people fighting to live today and then fighting to be able to live another day.
yes,
I would much rather be alive and be in front of a court and having to account for my decisions than being dead and not being able to even account for your choices. It's not
yes,
complicated, it's very straightforward. And there is that aspect that the Indian legal system, which has inherited its foibles and its vices and its biases from colonialists, still doesn't see the value of a Hindu life in the way that it should. And this is something that really must be resolved very, very quickly.
yes, it really needs addressing. Many people are saying that with these judges and their observations, it really does make Hindus feel like second class citizens in their own country. They feel they are now being pushed against because Nupur Sharma, she said a few things. Many will say what she said was absolutely correct, but we also have to look at the reaction of those that were feeling insulted by them. Surely they have to come under the spotlight and question that why is there this overreaction to any comment, any question, any criticism of their faith? And it's not just in India, we've seen it in Paris, we've seen it around the world, where maybe the question needs to, and the spotlight and the focus needs to go onto the reactions of the people causing the upheaval and the unrest, because fundamentally, Nipur Sharma did not ask anyone to be killed, murdered. She didn't incite violence or hatred. She just quoted what she believed to be correct from the texts. And it's the reaction that surely needs to come under scrutiny.
Well, this is the context which has been created now, the framework which has been created within which the Supreme Court has to um, deliver justice.
Yeah.
And there are so many contradictions in this whole scenario. Any lawyer with a smidgen of ability would be able to look at all of the contradictions and say, this is not justice. That
Yeah.
there is a double standard, at least a double standard, triple standard. That the principle that the law is blindfolded and everybody is equal in front of the law, that's on trial. This
Yes.
is really what's on trial. And quite rightly, as you say, this is on trial throughout the world. And, everybody is being encouraged to adopt a way of understanding which is unjust, a way
Yeah.
of understanding which is blindfolded, which is duplicitous, which is unequal, one law for one, another law for another. And all of these aspects, they undermine the very principle of justice and law. And so I think the circumstances that have arisen now, Nupur Sharma may have been the reactionary person responding to an incendiary statement, and she has kicked off a set of events which have now created a particular framework. A container has been created. And in this container, Nupur Sharma is actually the least of the influential elements. There are much, much bigger ideologies, principles, and institutions now involved in this container. And my hope is that Nupur Sharma ji, she doesn't get ground down by the friction between all of these various institutions and principles, but that she is protected, because all of these institutions, all of these justices, all of these principles, they exist to protect the Nupur Sharmas of the world. They
Yes.
don't exist as some abstract um, shall we say, play that certain elevated beings can sort of dab in and out of and just have a bit of a hobby sort of an existence. No, this is the very fabric whereby a society protects its vulnerable people, whereby a
Yes.
society protects its values, its aspirations, its relationships. All of these are now in this container. And the justices have nowhere to go. Frankly speaking, history teaches us that when you have such unsound law, it's the law which gives way. You know, it doesn't take much to recognize that the British legal system supported the enslavement of the people of Bharat. They had
Yes.
laws in place which actively discriminated against the indigenous population. It
Yeah.
was perfectly
Absolutely.
legal in South Africa for
Yes.
whites to own land and for blacks to be deprived of it. It was
Yes.
perfectly legal for Hitler to do what he did. He always ensured that laws were passed prior to the atrocities that were then inflicted. So the
Yeah.
law is not something which is rigid, inflexible, and incapable of being improved upon. In
Yes.
fact, the Bharatiya Penal Code, like the British Penal Code, needs to be seriously reviewed, and right the way from the bottom all the way up to the top. We're
Yeah.
seeing that process happening here in the UK now. People are saying the UK should have a Bill of Rights. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. And
Yeah.
so, if somewhere which presents itself as the pinnacle of jurisprudence has the capacity for the people to review every aspect of it and say that we want to change the way in which law functions, for
Yeah.
heaven's sake, Bharat is big enough and mature enough to be able to at least do a better job and fix its own legal system now. So I think this is a catalyst. It's brought everything to a head. It was long overdue. It needed to be dealt with. And if
Yes.
there are justices who are under scrutiny for being corrupt, they should be suspended immediately, as would any other person in any other role. And
Yes.
so, yes, it can't be one law for the justices and then a different set of laws for all of the great unwashed messes, the undesirables and the unapproachables and all that rubbish. No, it has to be law by example, and justice
Sure.
must prevail.
Yes, and on a final note, Panditji, because of what the judges said, a lot of people are now feeling that secularism in India is very one-sided. How can those people start to feel comfortable in their own country when they feel, even as a majority, they are a minority? They're being treated as if they're being victim shamed, they're being um, pushed aside, their voices aren't being heard, they have to tread on eggshells if they want to make an opinion.
Well,
How can secularism be beneficial for all when when we hear judges speaking in such a manner.
It's nonsense. Um, there is no equality in Bharat. Secularism is one of those words in Bharat which has no internal integrity, so much so that it has no meaning. The actual essence of what secularism, when it's applied, how it manifests, is discrimination against Hindus. We see it in the mandirs, we see it in so many places, and it all rests on one fallacy. The fallacy being that the majority are always potentially violent to the minority. Whereas history teaches us otherwise. History teaches us that minorities can very often be toxic. Minorities can, in fact, be horrifically violent. And if we look through history, the most violence has always been as a result of the operation of toxic minorities. So this also is going to be dealt with. But there is a duty. You know, in a democracy, it's a very simple law that the majority decision wins the day. Not the
Yes,
dharmic decision, not the just decision, not the right decision.
yes,
The majority decision wins the day. Now, how clever do you have to be to realize that if you want your values to be upheld, then you need to ensure that the majority decision is in alignment with your values,
yes. And this is
which
why
means
it's so important that
you
people
have
go
to
out and
engage.
vote.
Well, it's more than just vote, you see, because even voting and then going to sleep until the next election is not the way in which a democracy can thrive. For a democracy to thrive, every day has to be a day of engagement. You're contributing your
Yes,
opinions and your hopes and your desires and your wants, and you're participating in society. That's
yes,
what a democracy is. And, in Bharat, we have to recognize this because there are other communities who have recognized this. And not only have they recognized this, they happily say, well, this is how you choose to work. We will
yes,
work within this system to our benefit.
yes.
How
They've
much
been very organized.
yeah, how much longer does the Bharatiya have to wait to figure this out? And once
Yes,
they figure it out, then all of a sudden they have the control over resources. They have
yes.
control over decision making within the political framework, within the legislative framework, within the judiciary.
So,
It doesn't take much more. We don't need a revolution. All we need is engagement. We need
yes,
every Sanatani, every member of that First Nation to every day be thinking, okay, what do I need to do? What is this privilege that has been given to me, that my capacity to function and to contribute and to determine the direction of this nation, that is an important gift. It's not
yes,
present in many parts of the world, and we do not want to lose it from Bharat. Bharat has always been not just a democracy, but a dharmocracy. And
yes,
if we're going to get back to that, we need to be able to bridle and tame this thing called a democracy, which means everybody get out, engage, find your politicians, find their policies, find their manifestos, speak with them, hold them accountable, and inform them of what it is what's desired. Get
yes.
organized, engage with democracy, and let's move Bharat through to the next tier, which is a dharmocracy.
That's beautifully said. Thank you, Panditji, because a lot of people have been complacent or thinking someone else will do it. But unless everyone
No,
takes an active role, there won't be change. So
correct.
that's wonderful. Thank you so much
It's
for
a
your
pleasure.
time today, Panditji. Lovely, lovely words of wisdom again. And let's see
Thank you.
what happens with this case with Nupur Sharma, because I'm not sure where she can go from here, actually.
I'm
Finally,
actually thinking it's getting better. I think on a day to day basis, her case is getting better and better. It may feel as though a snowball is gathering and it's getting bigger and bigger and,
yes,
it's gathering momentum, but she is in the right.
yes,
There is no doubt about it that
yes,
the only law which can find her guilty is actually a law which is not based on justice. It's based on religious edict. And that's not what Bharat and that's not what the democracy of the world have chosen. And so
yes,
this is the real battle. And I think this snowball will get bigger and bigger as more and more Bharatiyas and more people who worship democracy get involved in it, not just in Bharat, but in other parts of the world as well, because
yes.
this is the challenge that they're all going to face. And so I think Nupurji's case is actually going to go, maybe there's a little bit of darkness in this tunnel, but there is light. there
Right.
is light at the end of this tunnel. There's no doubt about it. And let's all give her the support that she needs, and let's all
Absolutely.
pray for a successful outcome in the short term. And let's pray for an enlightened revelation to dawn in the minds of our Supreme Court justices.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Panditji. Look
It's
forward
a
to our
pleasure.
next liaison. Jai Shri
Jai Shri
Krishna.
Ram ji. Jai Shri Ram.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.